15th chapter, concerning things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. It remains now to see how a prince should conduct himself towards his subjects and friends. And as I know many have written on this point, I expect I shall be considered presumptuous in mentioning it again, especially as in discussing it draw up my own set of rules. But it being my intention to write something which will be useful to him who understands it, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real rather than the imagined truth. For many have imagined republics and principalities which, in fact, they have never known or seen, because how one lives is so far removed from how one ought to live. He who neglects what is done for what ought to be done brings about self-ruin instead of self-preservation. For a man who wishes to be entirely virtuous soon comes to grief amongst those not so virtuous. Hence it is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong, and how to make use of this knowledge as and when he needs to. Therefore, leaving aside imaginary things and concentrating on reality, I say that all men, when they are spoken of, especially princes who have a higher profile, are noted for some of those qualities which bring them either condemnation or praise. And so it is that some are reputed to be extravagant, others miserly, using a Tuscan term because an avaricious person in our language is still one who desires to possess by robbery, whilst we call one miserly who is mean to himself with what he possesses. One is reputed generous, one greedy, one cruel, one compassionate, one effeminate and cowardly, another bold and brave, one affable, another arrogant, one lascivious, another pure, one is sincere, another deeds, one hard, another easy, one serious, another frivolous, one religious, another unbelieving, and so on. And I know everyone will agree that it would be most laudable for a prince to exhibit all these qualities that are considered good. But human nature being what it is, he is not entirely infallible, though he must be sufficiently wise to know how to steer clear of those vices which will lose him his state, and also to avoid, if he can, the less dangerous vices, though he may indulge in these with less hesitation and without incurring reproach. For if everything is considered carefully, it will be found that something which appears to be virtuous, if followed, could be his ruin, whilst something else, which appears to be wicked, if followed, may bring him security and prosperity. 16th chapter, concerning generosity and meanness. Commencing with the first of these, I say that it would be splendid to have the reputation for generosity. But to be generous without gaining fame from it will harm one. For if one exercises it sincerely, as one should, it may pass unnoticed, and it will be thought of as mean. Therefore, anyone wishing to maintain among men a reputation for largesse is obliged to be lavish, so that a prince thus inclined will exhaust all his resources, and will be compelled in the end, if he wants to maintain his reputation, to burden his people with taxes and do everything he can to raise money. This will soon make him hated by his subjects, and becoming poor, he will be a little better than anyone. Thus, with his extravagance having offended many and rewarded few, he is vulnerable to the very first sign of trouble and brought to grief by the first real danger. When he realizes this and wishes to draw back from it, he then runs the risk of becoming miserly. Therefore, a prince not able to be generous except to his cost, if he is a wise man, he need not fear the reputation of being mean, for in time he will come to be considered bounteous, seeing that with a sound economy he can defend himself against the tax, and is able to engage in military campaigns without overtaxing his people. So it transpires that he is generous towards those from whom he does not take, who are numerous, and mean to those to whom he does not give, who are but few. We have not seen great things done in our time except by those who have been considered mean. The rest have failed. Pope Julius II was assisted in reaching the papacy by a reputation for generosity, but he did not strive afterwards to keep it up, when he made war on the King of France. and he made many wars without imposing any extraordinary tax on his subjects, because he met his additional expenses out of his long periods of thriftiness. The present King of Spain would not have undertaken or conquered in so many campaigns if he had been reputed generous. A prince, therefore, if he does not have to tax his subjects in order to defend himself, if he does not become poor and abject, and if he is not forced to become greedy, should not worry about a reputation for meanness, for it is one of those vices which will enable him to govern. And if anyone should say, Caesar came to power by virtue of his generosity, and many others have reached the highest positions on the same account, I answer, either you are a prince, or on your way to becoming one. In the first case, this generosity is dangerous. In the second, it is essential to be considered generous. And Caesar was one of those who wished to become preeminent in Rome. But if he had survived after becoming so, and had not moderated his expenditure, he would have destroyed his own government. And if anyone should reply, there have been many princes who have done great things with armies who have been considered very generous. I say, either a prince spends his own money or other people's. In the first case, he ought to be spared. In the second, he should not neglect any opportunity to be generous. And to the prince who goes forth with his army, maintaining it by pillage, sack, and extortion, and handling other people's possessions, this generosity is essential. Otherwise, he would not retain the support of his soldiers. And those things which are neither yours nor your subjects you can readily give away, as did Cyrus, Caesar, and Alexander, because it does not diminish your reputation if you squander other people's resources, but enhances it. It is only squandering your own that will harm you. And nothing disappears so rapidly as generosity. For even whilst you exercise it, you are losing the ability to do so, and so become either poor or despised, or else, in avoiding poverty, avaricious and hated. And above all things, a prince should guard himself against being despised and hated. And generosity leads to both. Therefore it is wiser to have a reputation for meanness which brings disapproval without hatred, than to be compelled through seeking a reputation for generosity to incur a name for avarice which brings both disapproval and hatred. Seventeenth chapter, concerning cruelty and compassion, and whether it is better to be loved than feared. Coming now to the other qualities mentioned, I maintain that every prince should want to be considered compassionate rather than cruel. Nevertheless, he ought to take care not to abuse his compassion. Cesare Borgia is considered cruel. Nevertheless, his cruelty reconciled the Romagna, unified it, and restored it to peace and loyalty. And in actuality, he will be seen to have been much more merciful than the Florentine people, who, to avoid a reputation for cruelty, permitted Pistoia to be devastated. Therefore a prince, so long as he keeps his subjects united and loyal, ought not to mind the reproach of cruelty, because with a few examples he will prove to be kinder than those who, through too much kindness, allow disorders to arise from which follow murders or robberies. For these may then harm all the people, whilst those executions which stem from the prince offend the individual only. And of all princes, it is impossible for the new prince to avoid the accusation of cruelty, owing to new states being full of danger. Hence, Virgil, through the mouth of Dido, excuses the inhumanity of her reign because of its newness, saying, Res dura et regni novitas metalia cogunt, miliri et late fines custodi tueri. Or, against my will, my fate, a throne unsettled in an infant state, bid me defend my realms with all my powers, and guard with these severities my shores. Nevertheless, he ought to be slow to act, and should himself show no fear, but proceed in a temperate manner with prudence and humanity, so that too much confidence does not make him rash, and too much distrust render him unbearable. On this a question arises, whether it is better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Since in general, men are ungrateful, fickle, cowardly, and avaricious. But as long as you are successful, they are yours entirely. They will shed blood for you, risk their property, life, children, and the dangerous remote. When it is close, they will turn against you. And the prince who, relying entirely on their promises, takes no other precautions, is ruined. Because friendships that are bought, rather than achieved by greatness and ability of mind, may indeed be earned, but are not long-lasting, and in time of crisis cannot be relied upon. And men have less scruples in offending one who is loved than one who is feared. For love is preserved by a bond which, due to the failings of men, is broken with every opportunity to go wrong. But fear is strengthened by the dread of punishment. Nevertheless, a prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that he is not loved, at least he avoids hatred, because he can survive very well being feared and not hated. And this will continue as long as he leaves alone the property of his people and their women. But when it is necessary for him to execute something, he must do it with proper justification and manifest reason. And above all, he must keep his hands off the property of others, because men more quickly forget the death of their father than the loss of the inheritance. Besides, pretexts for confiscating property are always available. For he who has embarked on a life of crime will always find excuses for seizing other people's property, whereas reasons for execution are, on the contrary, more difficult to find and sustain. But when a prince is campaigning and is in command of large numbers of soldiers, he can disregard the reputation for cruelty, because without it he would never keep his army united and disciplined. Among the wonderful deeds of Hannibal, one is foremost. Having led an enormous army composed of many various races to fight in foreign lands, no dissensions arose either amongst his men or against him, whether things were going well or badly. This was partly because of his inhuman cruelty, and partly due to his limitless courage, which made him both revered and feared by his soldiers. But without that cruelty, his other virtues would have been insufficient to produce this effect. Short-sighted historians admire Hannibal's deeds from one point of view, but from another condemn the principal cause of it. That it is true his other virtues would not alone have been enough can be seen by the example of Scipio, a man unique during his own time and throughout history, but against whom his own army rebelled in Spain. This arose from nothing more than his excessive leniency, which gave his soldiers more license than is consistent with military discipline. For this, he was reproached in the Senate by Fabius Maximus, and called the corrupter of the Roman legions. The Locri were plundered by one of Scipio's officers, yet they were not avenged, nor was the officer punished, owing largely to Scipio's easygoing nature. So much so, that someone in the Senate, wishing to excuse him, said there were men who knew much better how not to go wrong than to correct the errors of others. This disposition, if Scipio had continued in command, would in time have destroyed his fame and glory. But he being under the control of the Senate, this harmful trait not only concealed itself, but contributed to his greatness. Returning to the question of being feared or loved, I have come to the conclusion that since men love as they please, but fear according to the wishes of the prince, a wise prince should establish himself upon what he can control and not on what he cannot. And he must endeavor at all costs, as I said, to avoid hatred. 18th chapter, concerning the way in which princes should keep their word. Everyone acknowledges how praiseworthy it is in a prince to keep faith and to live with integrity and not with guile. Nevertheless, our experience has been that those princes who have achieved great things have regarded good faith as of little value, and have tricked men by deceit, and in the end have overcome those who have trusted them. You must know there are two ways of contending, the one by law, the other by force. The first method is natural to man, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently insufficient, it is essential to have recourse to the second. Therefore it is necessary for a prince to understand how to take advantage of the beast and the man. Princes have learnt this from the classical writers who describe how Achilles and many other ancient princes were given to the centaur Chiron to train in his own discipline, which means that, as they had for teacher a half beast and half man, so a prince learned how to make use of both natures, and that he cannot survive with one and not the other. A prince, therefore, being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, should choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore the fox discovers the snares, and the lion terrifies the wolves. Those who rely simply on the lion do not understand this. A wise prince cannot, nor should he, keep his promise if it proves to be a disadvantage, and when the circumstances that gave rise to that promise no longer exist. If all men were good, this precept would not hold. But because they are bad and will not keep faith with you, you too are not bound to keep your promises to them. Nor shall a prince ever lack good excuses for breaking his promise. Endless modern examples can be given, showing how many pacts and promises have been broken through the dishonesty of princes. And the prince, who knows best how to imitate the skills of the fox, comes off best. But he must know how to disguise this characteristic, and to be a great liar and hypocrite. Men are so simple, and so involved with their current problems, that he who wants to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. One recent example I must relate. Alexander VI did nothing else but deceive men, nor ever thought of doing otherwise, and was never short of it. For there was never anyone who had more gravitas, or who could make greater promises, yet would inevitably break them. Nevertheless, his lies always succeeded as he wanted, because he understood his son. Therefore, a prince must not only have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but also appear to them. And I should dare to say this also, that to have them and always to observe them is hard, but to appear to them is easy. To appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright, and to be so, but always aware that should you require not to be so, you are able to and can change your position. And you must understand this, that a prince, especially a new one, cannot observe all those qualities for which men are respected, being often forced for his survival to act contrary to fidelity, friendship, humanity, and religion. Therefore it is necessary for him to be flexible, according to the winds and the variations of fortune. Yet, as I have said before, he should not diverge from the proper course. But if he must do so, then he has to know how to. For this reason, a prince should take care that he never utters a word that is not compatible with the above-named 5 qualities, that he may appear to be always merciful, faithful, humane, upright, and religious. It is especially important to appear to have this last quality, since men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because everyone can see you, but few come in close touch with you. Everyone can see what you appear to be, but few really know what you are. And those few dare not oppose the opinions of the majority who have the power of the state to defend them. And in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, whom it is not prudent to challenge, one judges by the result. For that reason, Given that a prince gains the credit of conquering and holding his state, his methods will always be considered honorable, and he will be universally praised, because the common sort are always taken in by appearances and by results, and in the world there are only the common people, for the few find a place there only when the many have no ground to rest on. One prince of the present time, whom I had better not name, never preaches anything else but peace and good faith. Yet to both he is most hostile, and if he had kept either, his reputation and kingdom would have been lost many times over. Nineteenth chapter. The need to avoid being despised and hated. Now, having discussed the more important qualities above, I wish to speak briefly of the others under this heading. The prince must consider, as has been in part said before, how to avoid those things which will make him hated or contemptible, and as long as he is successful, he will have fulfilled his role, and he need not fear any reprisals. It makes him hated above all things, as I have said, to be rapacious and to violate the property and women of his subjects. When neither their property nor honor is touched, the majority live happily, and he has only to contend with the ambition of a few, whom he can deal with easily in a number of ways. It makes him contemptible to be considered fickle, frivolous, effeminate, mean-spirited, irresolute, all of which a prince should avoid like the plague, and he should try to show in his actions greatness, courage, gravity, and fortitude, and in his private dealings with his people he should show that his judgment is irrevocable, and maintain his reputation so that no one can hope either to deceive him or to get round him. The prince who conveys this impression of himself and who is highly esteemed is not easily conspired against, for provided it is well known that he is an excellent man and revered by his people, he can only be attacked with difficulty. For this reason, a prince should have only two fears, one internal from his own subjects, and the other external from foreign powers. From the latter, he is defended by being well armed and having good allies, and if he is well armed, he will always have good allies. Domestic affairs will always remain quiet when foreign affairs are quiet, unless they have already been disturbed by conspiracy. And even should affairs abroad be disturbed, provided the prince has carried out his preparations and has lived as I have suggested, and as long as he does not despair, he will resist every attack, just as I said Nabis the Spartan did. But concerning his subjects, when affairs abroad are not disturbed, he has only to fear a conspiracy from within. A prince can easily guard against this by avoiding being hated and despised and by keeping his people satisfied. And one of the most effective remedies that a prince can have against conspiracies is not to be hated and despised by his subjects. For he who plots against a prince must be able to please the people by their prince's removal. But when the conspirator will only succeed in offending the people, he will not have the courage to take such a course, for the difficulties that will confront him are endless. Indeed, experience shows there have been many conspiracies, but few have been successful. For the conspirator cannot act alone, nor can he enlist co-conspirators except from those whom he believes to be dissatisfied. And as soon as you have divulged your intent to a malcontent, you have given him the means with which to blackmail you to his own advantage. Seeing the benefit from this course, and the doubts and dangers of the other, the fellow conspirator must be a very rare friend, or a thoroughly relentless enemy of the prince, to keep faith with you. To put it briefly, I say that on the side of the conspirator there is nothing but fear, jealousy, and the prospect of punishment to terrify him. But on the side of the prince, there is the authority of government, the laws, the protection of friends, and the state to defend him. So, adding to all these things the goodwill of the people, it is impossible that anyone should be so rash as to conspire. For whereas in general the conspirator suffers fear before his plot is carried out, in this case he has also to fear the sequel to the crime, because the people become his enemies, and thus he cannot hope for any escape. I could give endless examples on this subject, but I will be content with just one, which happened within living memory. Messer Annibale Bentivogli, who was prince in Bologna, grandfather of the present Annibale, was murdered by the Canneschi, who had conspired against him. Not one of his family survived except Messer Giovanni, who was a child. Immediately after this assassination, the people rose and murdered all the Canneschi. This sprung from the goodwill of the people, which the house of Bentivogli enjoyed in those days in Bologna. The feeling was so great that although no one remained after the death of Annibale who was able to rule the state, the Bolognese, hearing that one of the Bentivogli family was in Florence, he had up to that time been considered the son of a blacksmith, sent to Florence for him and gave him the government of their city, and he ruled there until Messer Giovanni was old enough to take over. That is why I consider that a prince should pay little heed to conspiracies when his people hold him in high esteem. But when they are hostile to him, he ought to fear everything and everybody. Well-run states and wise princes take care not to drive the nobles to desperation and to keep the people satisfied and contented, for this is one of the most important objectives a prince can have. Among the best ordered and governed kingdoms of our times is France, and in it are found many good institutions on which depend the liberty and safety of the king. Of these, the first is the Parliament and its authority, because the founder of the kingdom, knowing the ambition of the nobility and their boldness, considered that a bit in their mouths would be necessary to restrain them, and, on the other side, knowing the hatred of the people based on their fear of the nobles, he wished to protect them, yet was not anxious for this to be the particular responsibility of the king. Therefore, to absolve himself from the nobles' reproach for favouring the people, and from the people's blame for favouring the nobles, he set up an independent arbiter who could crush the great and favour the weak without reproach on the king. Neither could you have a better or more prudent arrangement, nor a greater sense of security to the king and kingdom. From this, one can draw another important conclusion, that princes ought to delegate the responsibility of enacting unpopular measures to others, but grant favours in his own name. And further, I consider that a prince ought to nurture the nobles, but not so much as to make himself hated by the people. It may appear perhaps to some who have examined the lives and deaths of the Roman emperors that many of them are an example which contradicts my theory. Some lived worthy lives and showed great qualities of character. Nevertheless, they lost their empire or were murdered by their own men who conspired against them. Wishing, therefore, to answer these criticisms, I shall recall the characters of some of the emperors and show that the causes of their ruin were much the same as I suggested. At the same time, I shall only submit for consideration those examples that are well known to students of the period. It seems to me sufficient to take all those emperors who succeeded to the empire, from Marcus the philosopher down to Maximinus. They were Marcus and his son Commodus, Pertinax, Julian, Severus and his son Antoninus Caracalla, Macrinus, Heliogabalus, Alexander, and Maximinus. First, it is important to note that, whereas in other principalities only the ambition of the nobles and the insolence of the people have to be dealt with, the Roman emperors had a third difficulty. They had to contend with the cruelty and avarice of their soldiers, a matter so beset with problems that it was the downfall of many. But it was very hard to give satisfaction both to the soldiers and the people. The people loved peace, and for this reason they loved the unaspiring prince, whilst the soldiers loved the warlike prince who was bold, cruel, and rapacious, and it was these qualities they wanted him to exercise upon the people so that they could get double pay and give vent to their greed and cruelty. The result was that those emperors were always overthrown who, whether by birth or training, had no great authority. And recognizing the difficulty of those two opposing views, most of them, especially those who came new to the principality, were inclined to give in to the demands of the soldiers, caring little about harming the people. This course was necessary because, as princes cannot help being hated by someone, they should in the first place avoid being hated by everyone. When they cannot achieve this, they should use their best endeavors to avoid the hatred of those most powerful. Therefore, those emperors who, through inexperience, needed a special favor, turned more quickly to the soldiers than to the people, a course which turned out advantageous to them or not, depending upon whether the prince knew how to maintain authority over the soldiers. For these reasons, Marcus, Pertinax, and Alexander, men of modest life, lovers of justice, enemies to cruelty, humane and courteous, all came to a sad end, except Marcus. He alone lived and died in high esteem, because he had succeeded to the throne by hereditary title, and owed nothing either to the soldiers or to the people, and afterwards, with his many highly respected qualities, he always kept them both in their places whilst he lived, and was neither hated nor despised. But Pertinax was created emperor against the wish of the soldiers, who, accustomed to a licentious life under Commodus, could not cope with the decent life which Pertinax wished to impose upon them. So, having provided a reason to be hated, to which there was added a contempt for his old age, he was overthrown at the very beginning of his administration. And here it should be noted that hatred is acquired as much by good deeds as by bad ones. Therefore, as I said before, a prince wishing to keep his state is very often forced to do wrong. For when that body of people is corrupt whom you think you need to maintain your position, it may be either the people or the soldiers or the nobles, you have to pander to their demands and humour them, and in that case good deeds will only harm you. But let us come to Alexander. He was a man of such great goodness that, among his other praiseworthy deeds, in the 14 years he reigned, no one was ever put to death by him without trial. Nevertheless, as he was considered to be effeminate and thought to be dominated by his mother, he became despised, and the army rose up against him and murdered him. Turning now to the opposite characters of Commodus, Severus, Antoninus, Caracalla, and Maximinus, you will find them all cruel and rapacious, men who, to satisfy their soldiers, did not hesitate to commit every kind of iniquity against the people. And all, except Severus, came to a bad end. But in Severus there was so much nerve that, although the people were oppressed by him, he kept his soldiers happy and reigned successfully. For his courage made him so much admired in the eyes of the soldiers and the people that the latter were both astonished and awed, and the former respectful and satisfied. And because the deeds of this man as a new prince were so great, I wish to show briefly how well he imitated the fox and the lion, whose natures, as I said earlier, it is essential for a prince to emulate. Knowing the indolence of the Emperor Julian, Severus persuaded the army in Slavonia, of which he was captain, that it would be right to go to Rome and avenge the death of Pertinax, who had been killed by the Praetorian soldiers. Under this pretext, without appearing to aspire to the throne, he moved the army on Rome and reached Italy before it was known that he'd even started. On his arrival in Rome, the Senate, through fear, elected him emperor and killed Julian. After this, there remained for Severus, who wanted to be master of the whole empire, two obstacles. One in Asia, where Niger, head of the Asiatic army, had proclaimed himself emperor, and the other in the west, where Albinus also aspired to the throne. And as Severus considered it dangerous to declare himself hostile to both, he decided to attack Niger and to deceive Albinus. To the latter he wrote that as emperor elected by the Senate he was willing to share that honor with him, and sent him the title of Caesar, and, moreover, told him that the Senate had elected Albinus as his colleague, all of which was accepted by Albinus as true. But after Severus had conquered and killed Niger and pacified the east, he returned to Rome and complained to the Senate that Albinus, failing to recognize the benefits that he had received from him, had by treachery sought to murder him, and for this ingratitude Severus was compelled to punish him. Afterwards he sought him out in France and took from him his power and his life. He who will therefore carefully examine the deeds of this man will find him a most valiant lion and a most cunning fox. He will find him feared and respected by everyone, and not hated by the army. And it need not be wondered at that he, a new prince, was able to hold the empire so well, because his supreme renown always protected him from that hatred which the people might have brought against him for his violence. His son, Antoninus, was a most eminent man, and had very excellent qualities which made him admirable in the eyes of the people and acceptable to the soldiers. For he was a warlike man with considerable energy and a loathing of all delicate food and other luxuries, which won him the devotion of his troops. Despite this, his ferocity and cruelties were so great and so unheard of that after endless individual murders, he killed a large number of the people of Rome and all the citizens of Alexandria. Antoninus became hated by the whole world, and also feared by those he had around him, to such an extent that he was surrounded by his army and murdered by a centurion. And here it must be noted that such deaths, which are deliberately inflicted with a resolved and desperate courage, cannot be avoided by princes, because anyone who does not fear death can inflict them. But a prince need not fear them so much, because such fanatics are very rare. He has only to be careful not to do any serious harm to those he employs or has around him in the service of the state. Antoninus had not taken this care, but had unceremoniously killed a brother of that centurion, whom he also threatened daily, yet retained in his bodyguard, which, as it turned out, was a reckless thing to do, and proved to be the emperor's downfall. Now let us come to Commodus, for whom it should have been very easy to hold the empire. Being the son of Marcus, he had inherited it, and had only to follow in the footsteps of his father to please both his people and his soldiers. But being by nature cruel and brutal, he abandoned himself to debauching and corrupting the soldiers, so that he might indulge his greed upon the people. Also, he failed to maintain his dignity, often descending to the theatre to compete with gladiators and doing other vile acts unworthy of the imperial majesty. So Commodus fell into contempt with his soldiers, and being hated by one party and despised by the other, he was conspired against and killed. It remains to discuss the character of Maximinus. He was a very warlike man, and the armies, being disgusted with the effeminacy of Alexander, of whom I have already spoken, killed him and elected Maximinus to the throne. This he did not possess for long, for two things made him hated and despised. First, he came from humble origins, having once tended sheep in Thrace, which brought him into contempt, it being well known to everyone who considered a great indignity. And secondly, he deferred going to Rome and being formally invested as emperor. He had also gained a reputation for the utmost ferocity by having, through his prefects in Rome and elsewhere in the empire, practiced many cruelties, so that the whole world was moved to anger at the lowliness of his birth and to hatred at his barbarity. First Africa rebelled, then the Senate with all the people of Rome, and all Italy conspired against him, as did his own army. This latter, while besieging Aquileia and encountering difficulties in taking it, were so disgusted with his cruelties and fearing him less when they found so many against him, murdered him. I do not wish to discuss Heliogabalus, Macrinus, or Julian, who, being thoroughly contemptible, were quickly wiped out. But I will bring this discourse to an end by saying that modern-day princes are less likely to have this problem of giving inordinate satisfaction to their soldiers, because, though one has to give them some indulgence, none of them are experienced in the rule and administration of provinces as were the soldiers of the Roman Empire. And whilst in those times it was more necessary to give satisfaction to the soldiers than to the people, it is now more necessary for all princes, except the Turk and the Sultan ruler of Egypt, to satisfy the people rather than the soldiers, because the people are the more powerful. From the above, I have excluded the Turk, who always keeps round him 12,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry on on which depend the security and strength of the kingdom. And putting aside every consideration for the people, he needs to keep the soldiers as his friends. The kingdom of the Sultan is similar, being entirely in the hands of the soldiers. It follows again that he must keep them his friends, without regard to the people. However, you must note that the state of the Sultan is unlike all other principalities. It is like the papacy, which cannot be called either an hereditary or a newly formed principality. It is not the sons of the old prince who become the heirs, but he who is elected to that position by those in authority, and the sons remain only noblemen. And as this is an ancient custom, it cannot be called a new principality, since there are none of the difficulties encountered in new ones. Although the prince is new, the constitution of the state is old, and is framed so as to accept him as if he were the hereditary ruler. But, returning to the subject, I say that those following my argument will acknowledge that either hatred or contempt has brought about the downfall of the above emperors, and it will also be seen how, though some of them acted one way and some another, only one in each way came to a happy end, the rest coming to grief. It would have been useless and dangerous for Pertinax and Alexander, being new princes, to imitate Marcus, who was heir to the principality. Similarly, it would have been utterly destructive for Antoninus, Commodus, and Maximinus to have imitated Severus, as they did not have sufficient courage to follow in his footsteps. Therefore, a prince new to the principality cannot imitate Marcus and does not need to follow Severus, though he should take from Severus those qualities necessary to establish his state, and from Marcus those which are correct and outstanding to maintain an already stable and secure state. 20th chapter. Are fortresses, and many other things to which princes often resort, advantageous or hurtful? 1. Some princes, in order to hold the state securely, have disarmed their subjects. Others have kept their towns distracted by factions. Some have deliberately fostered animosity against themselves. Others have tried to win over those they distrusted before. Some have built fortresses, others have destroyed them. And although one cannot give a final judgment in all of these matters without being in possession of the full facts of each case, nevertheless, I will speak as comprehensively as I can on a general basis. 2. No new prince has ever disarmed his subjects. On the contrary, when he has found them unarmed, he has always armed them. By arming them, you arm yourself, and those men who were distrusted become faithful, and those who were faithful remain so, and your subjects become your devotees. And though not all subjects get armed, those whom you do arm benefit so that the others can be more easily dealt with. This difference in their treatment, which they quite understand, makes dependence of those you arm, and those you do not, realizing that they who have the most danger and responsibility should have the greater reward, excuse you. However, when you disarm the people, you at once offend them by showing that you distrust them either for cowardice or for disloyalty, and either of these opinions breeds hatred against you. And because you need to defend yourself, you turn to mercenaries, whose character I have already discussed. And even if they were good, it would not be enough to defend you against powerful enemies and distrustful subjects. Therefore, as I have said, a new prince and a new principality always arms his subjects. History is full of examples of this. But when a prince acquires a new state which he adds as a province to his old one, then he must disarm all the men of that state except those who have been his supporters in acquiring it. And even these, with time and opportunity, should be rendered weak and ineffectual. And matters must be arranged in such a way that all the armed men in the new state shall be your own soldiers who served close to you in your old state. 3. Our forefathers, and those who were considered wise, were accustomed to say that it was necessary to hold Pistoia by factions and Pisa by fortresses. And with this idea, they fostered strife in some of their subject towns so as to keep possession of them more easily. This may have worked well in those times when Italy was in a way balanced. but I do not believe that it can work today because I do not believe that factions can ever be of use. On the contrary, it is certain that when the enemy attacks you in a divided city, you are quickly defeated because the weakest party will always assist the enemy and the other party will be unable to resist. The Venetians, motivated, I believe, by these reasons, fostered the Guelph and the Ghibelline factions in their subject cities, and although they never allowed them to come to bloodshed, they nonetheless nursed these disputes so that the citizens, distracted by their differences, did not unite against them. As we saw, things did not afterwards turn out as expected, because after the rout at Veia, one party at once took courage and seized the state. These methods argue, therefore, the weakness of the prince, because these factions would never be permitted in a strong principality. Such methods which enable one to manage one's subjects more easily are only useful in times of peace, and if war comes, these policies then prove faulty. 4. Without doubt, princes become great when they overcome the difficulties and obstacles that confront them. Therefore, fortune, especially when she wants to create a new prince who has a great need to earn renown and a hereditary one, causes enemies to rise up and conspire against him, in order that he might then have the opportunity to overcome them and mount higher as on a ladder raised by his enemies. For this reason, many consider that a wise prince, when he has the opportunity, ought to foster some animosity against himself, so that, having crushed it, his reputation may rise higher. 5. Princes, especially new ones, have found more loyalty and usefulness in those men who in the beginning of their rule were doubted, than among those who in the beginning were trusty. Pandolfo Petrucci, Prince of Siena, ruled his state more with the support of those he had distrusted than of the others. But on this question one cannot speak generally, for it varies so much with the individual. I will only say this, that those men who at the beginning of a princedom have been hostile, if they are of the type to need help in supporting themselves, can always be won over with the greatest ease, and they will resolutely and loyally serve the prince, as they know it to be essential for them to put right the bad impression he had formed. So the prince always finds them of more use than those who, feeling too secure in his service, may neglect his affairs. And since it is expedient, I must warn the prince, who by means of special favours has acquired a new state, that he must carefully consider the motives of those who granted these favours, and if it was not out of a natural affection for him, but only out of discontent with their government, then he will find it very difficult to keep them friendly, for it will be impossible to satisfy them. Weighing up the reasons for this in those examples which can be taken from both past and present times, we shall find that it is easier for the prince to make friends of those men who were happy under the former government, and are therefore his enemies, than of those who were discontented with it, and supported and encouraged him to seize it. 6. It has been customary with princes, in order to hold their states more securely, to build fortresses that may serve as a curb on those who might plot against them, and as a place of refuge from a first attack. I praise this system because it has been used for a long time. Notwithstanding that, Messer Niccolo Vitelli in our own time has been seen to demolish 2 fortresses in Città de Castello, so that he might keep that state. Guido Urbano, Duke of Urbino, on returning to his dominion whence he had been driven by Cesare Borgia, destroyed all the fortresses in that province, and considered that without them it would be more difficult to lose it. The Bentivoglio, returning to Bologna, came to a similar decision. Fortresses, therefore, are useful or not according to circumstances. If they do you good in one way, they harm you in another. And this question can be reasoned as follows. The prince who has more to fear from his people than from outsiders should build fortresses. But he who has more to fear from outsiders than from his people should leave them alone. The castle of Milan, built by Francesco Sforza, has made and will make more trouble for the House of Sforza than any other disturbance in the state. For this reason, the best possible fortress is that you not be hated by the people, because though you may hold the fortresses, they will not save you if the people hate you. For there will always be outsiders keen to assist the people who have taken up arms against them. It has not been seen in our time that such fortresses have been of much use to any prince, unless to the Countess of Forli, when the Count Girolamo, her consort, was killed. For by means of her fortresses, she was able to withstand the popular attack and wait for assistance from the land, and thus recover her state. The circumstances were such at the time that outsiders were unable to assist her. But fortresses were of little value to her afterwards, when Cesare Borgia attacked her and when the people, her enemy, joined forces with the invaders. Therefore it would have been safer for her, both then and before, to have been friendly with her people and dispensed with the fortresses. All these things considered then, I shall praise those who build fortresses as well as those who do not. But I shall blame those who, putting their trust in their fortresses, do not care if they are hated by the people. _21st chapter. How a prince should conduct himself so as to gain renown. Nothing makes a prince so much esteemed as great deeds and setting a fine example. We have in our own time Ferdinand of Aragon, the present King of Spain. He could almost be called a new prince, because he has risen by fame and glory from an insignificant king to the foremost king in Christendom. And if you consider his deeds, you will find all of them great and some of them quite extraordinary. In the beginning of his reign, he attacked Granada, and this campaign was the foundation of his dominion. He did this quietly at first, without any fear of resistance, for he kept the minds of the barons of Castile occupied with the war, and not anticipating any innovations. Thus they did not realize that by these means he was acquiring power and authority over them. With money from the church and from the people, he was able to sustain his armies, and during that long war, to lay the foundation of the military skill for which he had become famous. Further, always using religion as a pretext so as to undertake even greater campaigns, he devoted himself with a pious cruelty to driving out and clearing his kingdom of the Moors. Nor could there be a more striking example, nor one more rare. Under the same pretext he assailed Africa, he invaded Italy, and he has finally attacked France. So his achievements and plans have always been great, and have kept the minds of his people occupied in suspense and admiration. And his actions have arisen in such a way, one followed closely by the other, that men have never had the time to plot against him. Again, it greatly helps a prince to set unusual examples in internal affairs similar to those attributed to Messer Bernardo da Milano, who, if anyone in civil life did something extraordinary, either good or bad, would use some method of rewarding or punishing him which would get everyone talking. And the prince should always, above everything, endeavor to get himself the reputation of being a great and remarkable man. A prince is also much respected when he is either a true friend or a downright enemy. In other words, when he declares himself without any reservation in favor of one party against the other. This will always be more favorable than remaining neutral. In the first case, when you have two powerful neighbors who are of such a character that should they come to blows you might be in danger from the victor, it will always be more advantageous to you to declare yourself one way or the other and join the battle. Because if you do not declare yourself, you will invariably fall prey to the conqueror, to the pleasure and satisfaction of the vanquished, and you will have no excuse nor anything to protect you. For the victor does not want dubious friends who will not help him in a crisis, and the vanquished will not offer you protection because you did not willingly take their side during the war. Antiochus went into Greece because he was asked by the Aetolians to drive out the Romans. He sent envoys to the Achaeans who were friends of the Romans, exhorting them to remain neutral, but the Romans urged them to take up arms on their own behalf. This question came to be discussed in the council of the Achaeans, where Antiochus's legate urged them to stand neutral. To this the Roman legate answered, "As for what has been said, that it is better and more advantageous for your state not to interfere in our war, nothing could be further from the truth, because by your not interfering you would be left, without favor or consideration, the victor's prize." So it will always happen that he who is not your friend will demand your neutrality, whilst he who is your friend will entreat you to take up arms on his behalf. And irresolute princes, to avoid immediate dangers, generally follow the neutral path and are generally ruined. But when a prince declares himself in favor of one side and the party with whom he allies himself conquers, the victor may be all-powerful and have him at his mercy, but he is also indebted to him, and a bond of friendship is established. And men are never quite so shameless that they would show ingratitude by oppressing you afterwards. Victories, after all, are never so complete that the victor must not show some regard for law and justice. But if he with whom you ally yourself loses, you may be protected by him, and whilst he can, he may help you, and you can work in partnership to improve your respective fortunes. In the second case, when those who fight are of such a character that you have no fear as to who may conquer, it is even more important to be allied to the one side or the other, because you assist in the destruction of one with the help of the other, who, had he been wise, would have saved him instead. And since the conqueror, with your assistance, cannot fail to succeed, he remains at your mercy. And here it must be noted that a prince should never make an alliance with one more powerful than himself in order to attack others, unless necessity compels him, as described. Because if he conquers, you are at his mercy, and princes should avoid as much as possible being at the mercy of anyone. The Venetians joined with France against the Duke of Milan, and this alliance, which caused the ruin of the Venetians, could have been avoided. But when it cannot be avoided, as happened to the Florentines when the Pope and Spain sent armies to attack Lombardy, then, for the above reasons, the prince should favor one of the parties. Never let any government imagine that it can choose perfectly safe courses. Rather let it expect to have to take very risky ones, because it is usual that one seldom avoids one trouble without running into another. But wisdom consists in knowing how to distinguish the nature of the troubles and then choosing the lesser evil. A prince ought also to recognize ability and to honor those proficient in every art and trade. At the same time, he should encourage his citizens to practice their occupations peaceably, both in commerce and agriculture and in every other employment, so that they should not be deterred either from improving their possessions for fear that they be taken away, or for starting up business for fear of taxes. Instead, the prince ought to offer incentives to those wanting to do these things and to anyone who strives to increase the prosperity of the city or state. Further, he ought to entertain the people with festivals and spectacles at convenient seasons of the year. And as every city is divided into guilds or family groups, he ought to hold them in high regard and associate with them sometimes, and show himself an example of courtesy and liberality, nevertheless always maintaining the dignity of his rank, for this must never be devalued.